The big meme going around now, something that is beginning to leak its way into the mainstream media, is this idea of buck breaking. Now, you've probably seen about 50 to 100 memes about this by now. Now, this was a documentary put out by Tariq Nasheed, in which he alleges that it was a systematic practice that slave owners during slaveholding times in the United States would routinely anally rape the largest slaves in order to weaken their position in the eyes of other slaves, in order to combat slave rebellions or what have you. Now, he has a whole documentary about this in which it makes several other allegations about white people. Now, here's the problem. As a systemic practice, buck breaking was never a thing. This is a complete and utter fiction on his part. He invented this himself after receiving some kind of vague word-of-mouth claim. There's no historical evidence for this whatsoever. There's a mountain of historical evidence of slave women being raped by masters. That was a very common practice, and something that there's an astronomical amount of proof of. But this idea of breaking bucks just simply isn't true. It was completely made up. But why someone would go to the point of making that up is something I'm going to get into. The problem here is that this is homophobia. Because it extends much further into the documentary, where it claimed that historically, white people only engaged in heterosexual intercourse for the purposes of procreation. Meaning that white people or white men were always gay and only ever touched women to have babies. Now, I don't think you have to actually be white to realize that that's a complete fiction. I'm pretty sure that I have had sex for reasons other than procreation. In fact, I've taken measures to avoid procreation, to be honest, and I think that's why birth control exists, as a measure of avoiding procreation. This claim that somehow all white men are gay is absurd to a degree that I shouldn't even have to explain this. Historians, like actual historians, people who actually studied history and didn't just, forgive the pun, pull things out of their ass, will show you that this buck-breaking thing just isn't true. It's a lie. I'm sure at some point or another a slave master would have raped a male slave, because that's the kind of cruelty that they were known for. But this idea that there was a huge systemic thing just isn't true. Tariq Nasheed completely fabricated this out of whole cloth. Now, I went to Tariq Nasheed's Twitter to see how he handled criticisms of this film. And he did what I was partly expecting, but partly wasn't expecting either, was that every time somebody showed evidence that he was wrong, or asked for proof of what he was claiming, he would demonize them based on skin color. And if the person happened to be black, he would accuse them of being an Uncle Tom. Well, you see, that the problem is that's not how history works. History is based on what evidence that you can find, and sometimes you have to piece together incomplete information to get a picture of what was happening. For example, the city of Troy was believed to not exist. And then some guy spent 10 years doing archaeological work and found it. Fabricating something out of whole cloth is completely different. And another part of this that's very disgusting is the blatant and overt homophobia. Remember, Gay sex is something that slave owners did to slaves, according to Tariq Nasheed. Gay sex was something the white man did all the time for his own pleasure. There's a very blatant demonization of homosexuality here. And it's frankly disgusting. And yes, I know many people are going to note that it's coming from a man who's gay himself. There are multiple images of Tariq Nasheed kissing white men and dating white men. It would seem very strange that he would make this kind of accusation given his past choice of relationships, particularly homosexual relationships. Now here comes the dirty conclusion that I have. This documentary came out after he was dumped by a white man, meaning the production of this came out after that. In my opinion, given the evidence that's available, which is more than what he has for his documentary, he chose to do this as revenge against white men for him being dumped. Or maybe multiple failed relationships with white men. The way an incel will demonize women for not going out with him, or cheating on him, or breaking up with him. Or not even necessarily an incel, but that kind of male rage at a woman for daring to reject him or cheat on him. That is wholly and completely reflected here. Now, he can't demonize men because he is one. But he can demonize white men for it. Now, there's a great deal of actual historical crimes of white people against black people. No one here is denying that. And especially not someone who, myself, who wholly believes in decolonization. But this is nonsense. This is pitiful. This is self-pity. Angry, knee-jerk reaction to being dumped, to a failed relationship, being turned into an attack on white people. And in fact, we see the same with Ghazi Goto of Black Hammer. He too, multiple pictures of him kissing white men, openly gay, dated a lot of white men. Then all of a sudden, he got cheated on by a white guy. And then he goes off the deep end with all the nonsense he has now. I think there's a deliberate attempt here to demonize homosexuality within black nationalism, which is also a problem in and of itself. I shouldn't have to explain why homophobia is wrong. I think you can get that yourself. But it's interesting that we've seen this trend from two radical black nationalists. Homophobia repackaged as liberation, I guess? I mean, that's not really liberation, but I think that's what they're going for in this. And I thought it was important to comment on this because there are really only two voices at this time. The people who uncritically accept everything that Tariq Nasheed says, regardless of how ridiculous it is, and people who are just using racism as a response to what he says. But it takes a much more nuanced and level-headed head to respond to these kinds of things. I make the statement that I make because there is no evidence for what is being claimed. This is a fiction on his part. At best, he has word of mouth of one person who claims it. Any historian, even ones that, aren't racist, and there is such thing as racist, as historians who are not racist, there is no evidence for this. It's a fiction, and it should be denounced as a fiction. And let me just make one last point. Yes, I'm aware that I'm white, and therefore wrong. I know this may be a hard concept for a lot of people to understand, but my skin color actually does determine whether or not historical evidence for something actually exists. Such a foolish notion is continually used by Tariq Nasheed. And it is further evidenced by his inability to defend his work by providing any evidence and be able to make a rational argument besides attacking people who question him. I'm not talking about racist attacks on him. I'm talking about people asking him for evidence, or people saying, well, there's a problem here. You don't have any evidence for what you're saying. And then him responding with racially motivated responses. So, aside from being a low-effort meme used to attack black people, buck-breaking is complete and utter nonsense. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.